The city of Glasgow is currently host to the 26th Conference of the Parties, better known as COP26 UN Climate Change Conference. To mark this important event, the University of Glasgow is hosting a range of events exploring different aspects of how our research can tackle the causes and impacts of climate change. And the School of Interdisciplinary Studies is playing a full part in that. It has established itself as a creative, research-intensive university environment and an inclusive centre of excellence for interdisciplinary learning and teaching. It is committed to supporting the economic growth of the south of Scotland and in so doing works across the spectrum from local to global, in niche areas that are both matched to location and have national and international applicability. Research in the social sciences engages across the full breadth of climate issues. And for more than 50 years, that research has helped inform our understanding of the human drivers of climate change and, more recently, of how our behaviours can contribute to achieving net zero. Today, we are showcasing the work of our school, the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, where colleagues' specialisms include the environmental impacts of economic growth, the impacts of climate change on inequalities, including poverty and food security, nature-based solutions, risk reduction, resilience of coastal systems, and the list goes on. The recordings that follow give an indication of the strength, breadth, and depth of those international connections. They were gathered by my colleague, Professor Cecilia Tortajada, Professor in Practice at the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, and include ministers, heads of international organisations, presidents of international water associations, and leading academics from different parts of the world, who gathered in Glasgow on 28th and 29th October to discuss water security challenges under climate change. On behalf of the University of Glasgow School of Interdisciplinary Studies, I thank each participant for giving their time to make these recordings in order to share their views on one of the most immediate climate change issues facing the world and facing it right now.
Hello, my name is Alex Campbell and I'm the Head of Research and Policy at the International Hydropower Association, IHA. We're a non-profit membership association. We represent organisations committed to the responsible and sustainable development and operation of hydropower. Our members are active in over 120 countries and directly manage or operate around 450 gigawatts of the global installed hydropower capacity. So why is hydropower so important in the fight against climate change? Well, today hydropower provides between 15 and 20% of the world's electricity, more than any other low-carbon source. But, as many of you know, the power sector, or electricity generation, is a major source of carbon emissions. To tackle climate change, it is essential that we have more low-carbon generation. However, we're also going to need more electricity, full stop. This is driven by three key factors. By 2050, there will be more people, and they will be richer. So all other things being equal, they will consume more electricity. In addition, we will need to electrify significant parts of the economy that currently rely on fossil fuels. A clear example of this is road transport, where we're replacing petrol and diesel cars with electric vehicles. This too will increase the demand for electricity. Now, much of this new electricity generation will come from wind and solar. And to give you an example, one estimate from the International Renewable Energy Agency suggests we will have around 3 times as much electricity generating capacity by 2050 compared to today, with solar and wind each increasing more than 10 times. This is just to meet a 2-degree Paris target. The more challenging target, keeping temperature rises to below 1.5 degrees, will require significantly more. However, as we all know, it isn't always windy or sunny, which brings me to what former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull calls the crisis within the crisis. How do we provide green energy security, keeping the lights on without resorting to coal or gas? Today, that system flexibility, the ability to quickly start or stop generating electricity, is provided by hydropower and fuels like gas and coal. In future, there will be no place for fossil fuels to deliver this vital service. Analysis from organisations like the International Energy Agency and the International Renewable Energy Agency make it clear that hydropower will be the dominant source of flexible electricity generation in the future. So put simply, if we want green energy security, we will need more hydropower. Of course, this new hydropower needs to be delivered sustainably. As with any new infrastructure project, the construction of a hydropower facility will inevitably have local impacts on communities and the environment. So it's incumbent on all stakeholders, especially the hydropower developer and operator, to seek to maximise project benefits while avoiding, minimising or mitigating any negative impacts. What constitutes good and best practice in hydropower development is defined by the Hydropower Sustainability Tools, a set of guidelines and assessment tools governed by the Hydropower Sustainability Council, a multi-stakeholder group of representatives from energy companies, government agencies, financial institutions, and social and environmental NGOs. Furthermore, in September this year, a landmark declaration was issued by the hydropower sector at the conclusion of the 2021 World Hydropower Congress, with the support of governments and former prime ministers, NGOs, and international agencies. The San Jose Declaration on Sustainable Hydropower urges greater green investment in responsible hydropower development and places enhanced ESG performance expectations on the sector. The declaration puts forward a new set of fundamental principles and recommendations to drive forward hydropower's contribution to global climate goals. The San Jose Declaration provides a framework for enhancing hydropower's role in the clean energy transition. It has been shaped by a wide-ranging public consultation with participation from hundreds of organisations and individuals, including representatives from the hydropower industry, NGOs, international financial institutions, academia, and research institutions. At the heart of the declaration is a recognition that sustainable hydropower is a clean, green, modern, and affordable solution to climate change. Thank you.
Let me start with some things we know with great clarity. For a plethora of self-interested reasons, governments and industry around the world have delayed action on climate change for many decades. Even modest commitments under the Kyoto Protocol proved too demanding for all but a very small number of countries. Similarly, a large number of commitments under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals will go the same way and be largely unmet. Certainly, progress on providing access to safe and reliable water supplies under SDG 6 in many small, medium and large cities in developing countries has been pretty abysmal. The targets will come not even close to being met in over 100 countries. High population growth rates and ongoing migration to these cities will mean many hundreds of millions of people have no access to safe and reliable water supplies well beyond 2030. Water stress in many communities will increase. Failure to meet climate change goals, net zero emissions by 2050 and aggressive intermediate targets over the coming decade will effectively lock in additional adverse impacts of climate change on water availability and reliability in many regions and cities. While there is a very narrow path to meeting a 1.5 increase target, given government and business propensity for inaction, a central case is much more like 3 degrees. Should this case eventuate, it will have a big impact on extreme events, notably increased flooding and droughts, and on the provision of safe, secure water service in cities. On top of the existing need to meet shortfalls in access to safe and secure water supplies, which is already very demanding, we're going to need active and concerted adaptation strategies, not aspirational goals, to ameliorate adverse impacts from changes in patterns and the impact of additional flooding and droughts that will flow from climate change. City administrations, water service providers and national governments need to ensure that they are prepared and able to implement critical actions rather than fall prey to concerted greenwashing and a further plethora of excuses as we approach 2030 and onward to 2050. I want to touch on 4 actions. First, countries need strong, forward-looking, fit-for-purpose information sets that underlie water service provision. Existing water quality and coverage of safe water availability requires careful assessment. Understanding threats from changes in incidence and character of extreme events to existing service provision, as well as to the future expansion plans, is critical. Understanding how poorer communities will be affected by these events is equally critical. Good data and forward-looking science must be embedded in service provision. Advances in technology are helping here, but governments need to support getting the work done and follow-on actions implemented. Second, the focus on managing extreme events needs to shift from post-disaster management to active management of extreme event risk before it occurs. For example, this might be to ensure that future risk to service delivery assets from extreme events is well understood, and actions taken to reduce risk where that is needed. Bodies like the World Bank need to retune their lending practices to meet these changing needs. Third, and this goes to on-the-ground action, a key issue is having robust, corruption-free corporate governance systems in place. This will facilitate timely responses to emerging priorities. The importance of governance is well understood in theory, but lamentably, action to put good governance in place has been in extreme short supply. As the Water Integrity Network has emphasised, only a well-functioning, corruption-free water sector will be able to overcome the enormous challenges ahead. Finally, where informal markets are providing water services to slums and informal settlements, the regulatory framework needs to reflect underlying risk to water services wrought by climate change. These communities are at the centre of under-provision, unsafe, unreliable water supplies. Climate change will exacerbate their plight. They deserve better. My message to water service providers and government alike is that warm words count for 5%, concerted action for 95%. The time to act is now.
Yuma, hello. I'm Quentin Grafton and I'm a Professor of Economics and a Laureate Fellow and a UNESCO Chairholder at the Australian National University. I'm speaking to you on Ngunnawal Ngambri country. This is the lands, the traditional lands of the custodians of this country, the Aboriginal people who have been here for thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's my real pleasure to be given this opportunity to speak to you for 5 minutes or so in relation to climate change, in relation to what's happening in Australia, and of course the issues of Indigenous rights and governance in the context of climate change and their country. Of course, I am not the person to be speaking to you on Indigenous issues. It's Indigenous people who should be doing that. But I can point to their voices and their words that have been written down. I would ask you to read the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It makes it very clear that rights to their country, to their land, to their waters, to everything in the context of their traditional lands is part of the solution going forward. I also would ask you to look at the recent Summit on Nature and Indigenous Peoples. It's well worth reading because it highlights what needs to happen in the context of climate change. What needs to happen is not just rights for Indigenous people, it's also the practices that need to be supported. And it's also the issue of having voice at the table in the context of decision making, so that marginalized people aren't left behind and that the people who have knowledge over thousands of years are listened to. That's the Indigenous story, and it's a story that's emerging and evolving and will continue to provide insights to us in relation to climate change mitigation and particularly in the context of adaptation. Here in Australia, we're facing an emergency, a climate crisis and a water crisis. 2019 was the hottest year ever recorded in Australia. We had huge bushfires that covered millions, destroyed millions of hectares of land, killed over 1 billion, that's 1,000 million animals, many of them wild animals. 34 people died in the fires and hundreds of other people who died prematurely because of smoke inhalation. That's the sort of challenge we face in Australia. 2019 had a temperature exceeding 1.5 degrees centigrade relative to earlier years in the pre-industrial times in Australia. So that's a trend in terms of increasing temperature. We also have increasing dryness in many parts of Australia. And of course, Australia is an arid and semi-arid country. Dryness means less water, of course. It also affects water quality. And this is a huge issue, especially for Indigenous Australians, where thousands, in fact, over 100,000 Indigenous persons and people living in remote communities don't have access to adequate water quality. We, of course, in Australia have the Great Barrier Reef. And as we have increases in sea surface temperature, we have coral bleaching. So this challenge is everywhere in Australia, and unfortunately for us and for the world, of course, is that we don't have the climate policies in place to effectively deal with this. In particular, we had a carbon price. Yes, we in Australia had a carbon price introduced in July 2012, but it was removed in July 2014. And now, at this time, at the end, as we approach the end of 2021, it's still not available. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to do many things. We need to increase energy efficiency. We need to quadruple at least in terms of solar and wind power between now and 2030. We have to do a lot more in terms of electric vehicles and transportation. We have to protect country. We have to prevent the destruction of forests and land degradation. There are many, many things that are needed, not only in Australia, but globally. It's my pleasure to be part of this grouping that focuses on climate change, of course, for COP26. But the water issues are fundamental, because unless we deal with the water emergency and the emerging water crises in the context of climate change, because there already is an emergency, these are additional crises and challenges and multiplication factors. We will not deliver sustainable goal 6 and water for all by 2030, and we most certainly won't avoid catastrophic climate change, which is coming our way, unless we move away on a different path, a pathway that we know is available to us, but we have to walk along that path and with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So in closing, thank you for the opportunity. I wish you the best of success, as I won't be able to join you in person, but I wish everyone, in terms of the deliberations, focus on solutions so we can have a better world, a better planet, and of course, better outcomes and the animals and creation that we share together. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My talk today will focus on agricultural water management under changing climate. And I will give you a few words about the ICID, the International Commission on Irrigation and Drainage, that was established in 1950 and was at the forefront of the Green Revolution after World War II. ICID is a leading scientific, technical, and professional, not-for-profit or international organization working in the field of irrigation, drainage, flood management to promote and achieve sustainable agricultural water management. ICID is also dedicated towards improving the status of agricultural water management practices, including rainfed agriculture, supplemental irrigation, depth irrigation, and full irrigation. ICID other core activities focus on the drainage of agricultural lands and the management of extreme climate events such as flood and droughts. The current challenges that really we are facing now is by 2050, the world population is expected to increase from 6 to 9 billion, and subsequently, the food demand is expected to increase by 70 to 100%. Water consumption is expected to increase by 50%. By 2030, a 40% overall gap between global water supply and demand is expected, and climate change predicted increased vulnerability of the agricultural sector in developing countries. So the impact of the climate change on agriculture, too much water can cause flood, and that has a negative effect on crop growth. Too much water, too little water could cause drought, and that would also have a negative effect on crop growth. Extreme conditions of gales, heat waves, cold also negatively affect the crop growth and agricultural production. And the predicted actually impact of climate change in terms of food, there is a chance that will be a falling yields in many developing countries. And in terms of water, significant decrease in water availability in many areas in the world. And also we will expect more droughts and flood events. The UK has been getting more frequently drought events recently than in the past. The 1976 droughts followed by several drought events and in a very short period of time. So the frequency of really drought is getting more and more, and severity as well of the drought. And we have seen also flood events in this year in 2021 in Europe, in Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And we have seen some really events how, like 1976 drought, how affected the water supply to households, where people had to queue in the streets of London really to get water from stand pipes. California currently also facing drought, and also since 2009, and that drought actually affected the water resources availability and food production. In the UK, we had a study to look at the different impacts of the climate change, especially the drought events. And we had 7 catchments from Scotland in the north to another catchments in Cornwall, Fowey. And those 7 catchments were really studied for the impact of climate change, especially drought events. This is example from the Don catchments in the Midlands, near Sheffield city. And we have been looking at the impact of climate change from 2020 up to 2099, and the impact on stream flow, especially during summertime where we need to irrigate crops, is really decreasing with the emission level and also with time. The same as well for the groundwater recharge. So we expect to have less groundwater available with increasing the emission and with time. And at the same time, soil moisture deficit is likely to increase. Evaporation also will increase. And when evaporation increases, it means that we need to add more water for irrigation. Also, we have been looking at the drought events, severity, and the frequency, and also we could see in that example that the frequency and the severity is also increasing with time. And we looked at the gap between water supply and the demand, and we can find here the gap is actually increasing with time in that catchment. And we found the same in other 6 catchments, apart from the Scotland, where the gap was actually a lot narrower than the other catchments. We also looked at the impact of climate change on seawater inundation in several sites around the UK, and there were 3 sites actually were vulnerable to the seawater inundation, and that had a negative impact on the marshlands and the areas of the lowlands around the coastal line. We also looked at the climate change and its impact on the growth periods of crops and the crop water requirements. And this example here for amaranth crop, where the season would be shortened by 16 days by 2095 under high emission scenarios. Possible approaches to deal with the impact of climate change during flood periods, high river flows, especially we could allow farmers to harvest and abstract and store water reservoirs for later use, increasing water supply during the rainfall events, and by rainfall harvesting, use of non-conventional water resources, increasing water use efficiency, accurate estimation of crop water requirements, precision irrigation and precision agriculture, use of non-conventional water resources like brackish, treated wastewater, and saline water, use of non-conventional, less water consuming drought and salinity tolerant crops, use of management models to optimize the impact, the input of water and fertilizers. So we can actually increase the water supply by allowing the runoff to go through certain holes to recharge the aquifer, and the aquifer actually could work as storage for water use later on. Also, we can harvest the water into surface reservoirs like these mountain lakes, and also we could cover these reservoirs, like that reservoir here in Berkshire in the UK, with a floating solar panel to minimize the losses by evaporation from those reservoirs. We could also use more efficient irrigation system that would actually minimize the losses by evaporation or wind drift, and that, like those ones, low nozzles, center pivot, or sprinklers, that would actually save 30% of the water used. We can also use a drip irrigation system, and subsurface would actually be a good saver for water. And this is an example of another system that we use twin drip lines, and the plant is in the middle, and we irrigate with one drip line at a time, and we alternate. So we irrigate half of the root zone at a time. And that would save actually 26% compared to the traditional drip irrigation, and 44% water saving compared to sprinkler. So if we could use that partial root drying twin drip lines and subsurface, which 10 to 12 centimeter below the surface. Also can increase the water supply by agricultural drainage water use, brackish groundwater, wastewater, treated, untreated, domestic, industrial, mining water, breweries, food packaging industry, sugar industry, fish farming, wastewater. This is an example of irrigating cherry tomatoes using saline water. And also we could use the aquaculture by using the water of the fish farms and irrigate with that water cereals. The other thing also we could use in situ and decentralized small scale wastewater treatment, and can be treated to the level that can be used to irrigate, especially for small communities. Also, selection of crops. We can encourage the use of less water consuming crops. There are tolerant crops, salinity tolerant crops, the use of rotation of deep and shallow rooted crops, heat and cold tolerant crops, and wind tolerant crops. In the UK, we have been trying here a quinoa, which is a drought and salt tolerant crops, and has been really growing quite well. Using of models can help us to predict the long-term impact of using any management in terms of water, in terms of fertilizers, in terms of salinity or saline water. And there are some publications, and it's free download from ICID website. And also we can minimize the water use by accurately estimating the crop water requirements. And here we use in our experiments the eddy covariance in kilometers to calculate the actual evapotranspiration, and that's equivalent to the crop water requirements. And also we use the Cosmos to determine the integrated soil moisture and soil moisture deficit, and the soil moisture deficit can be used as indication of the crop water requirements. And here we can see that we can save 50% of water when we measure the actual evaporation using these instruments compared to the classical methods, which depend mainly on equations. And the Cosmos here, we can see from the Cosmos experiments that we can have a good and accurate estimate of the soil moisture deficit, and we can give it color code. If it's green, We don't need to irrigate if it's red, so we irrigate with amount as indicated by soil moisture deficit. Also, we have to minimize the use of water for biofuel, as biofuel crops are faster growing crops and taking the areas of food production. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you. Bye for now.
I'm Leena Srivastav, Deputy Director General for Science at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, Austria. Let me start by thanking the School of Interdisciplinary Studies of the University of Glasgow for inviting me to send this video message. As we all know, climate change is real and upon us, and it is beginning to impact every part of our lives, physically, mentally, and emotionally. However, we must be open to consider that our actions to mitigate climate change do not necessarily take away from our quality of life. We have only become accustomed to living our lives and measuring it in a particular way. This way has given several of us a materially rich and secure life, but it has also created a number of stresses and pressures which take away from our happiness. For the majority of Earth's populations, human and otherwise, we have only created debilitating vulnerabilities. We can live our lives differently, more sustainably, as several of you have already started doing. Cycling to work or the university, using the train system for holidays, becoming vegetarian, consuming less, and so on. And we enjoy guilt-free happiness. Our patterns of growth and development have clearly put extreme stress on the life-giving resources of planet Earth, its air, its water, and its land. The resultant climatic changes are exacerbating these impacts on these resources exponentially and unpredictably. The greatest impact of climate change is likely to be seen on and through our water resources. Melting glaciers, rising sea levels, monsoon variabilities, floods and droughts, warming oceans, etc. There is a ton of literature on the impacts of climate change on our water resources and the management measures that can or should be put in place. But managing or adapting to climate change is easier said than done. Examples from even the richest parts of the world, look at the floods in Germany, for example, reveal to us that adaptation measures and disaster management are likely to become unbearably expensive, and not just financially, if we have uncontrolled climate change. Science calls for global average temperature increases to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial levels. We are likely to exceed this at least for a year or two within this decade, as per the World Meteorological Organization. Poor countries and poor populations would stand no chance. Nearly 3.2 billion people in the world already live in water stress situations, and 60% of irrigated cropland is stressed. The uncertainties, variability, and unpredictability of changes in precipitation patterns, combined with poor infrastructure, non-existent and increasingly unwilling insurance systems, inadequate extension services, and lack of coherence in governance, would leave all these people, and therefore the rest of us who depend on them for our food supplies too, in a critically vulnerable space. COP26, which is taking place in Glasgow, is therefore a conference of existential importance and can only be celebrated once we know how serious our leaders and governments are in securing all of us and the generations to come. An election cycle approach is incongruous with the challenges we are facing. But the young can ensure that even this incongruity is squarely addressed. They can also strongly signal more sustainable consumption and lifestyle choices that will force sustainability transformations in our future development pathways. As the IPCC 1.5 degree report has shown, every bit of climate change that we can avoid will make a difference, which means that each of our contributions, no matter how small, will add up to a significant whole. Thank you very much for listening to me, and all the very best.
Hello, everybody. It is a great pleasure to address all of you on the occasion of COP26. This is a very special moment during a pandemic, during an economic crisis, subsequently to the pandemic, a time of fear, a time of concern, of governments, people in general, the NGO community, the private sector. Everybody is extremely concerned with so many difficult things happening all over the world. However, I would like to bring a word of optimism in the middle of this very complex situation. COP26, it's a very good opportunity that we have to discuss the important impacts that climate has in the water sector. The impacts of climate change, of climate variability, happens in the water sector with prolonged droughts, with more intense floods. We need to be resilient to face these short-term impacts that we are facing now and will be facing in the near future. The previous COPs have discussed mainly mitigation aspects of climate change. I would like to bring to the attention of all of you of the importance to discuss adaptation in this COP26. The mitigation problem is related to energy and the impacts, the very severe impacts of climate change will be in the water sector, in the water resources management sector, because the situation of energy and these long-term impacts of warm-up, of sea level rise will be happening 100 years from now. And these droughts, these intense floods are felt as we speak in different parts of the world. So my message here is that governments should be paying more attention towards the adaptation aspects of the climate change discussion. We need to be more resilient. We need to invest in infrastructure that will provide us more storage to face the long droughts, more infrastructure to hold the severe floods that will be happening, that are happening as we speak now. So a great pleasure to be talking to you and thinking that governments will be more attentive to the aspects of adaptation in this COP26. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Distinguished colleagues, today I am going to talk about climate variability and its impact on hydrology and water supplies. This is a very important aspect in water management, in my opinion, which is not dealt with as much in detail by researchers as climate change impacts. In India, this phenomenon is taking a far greater toll on our water supply, water access, and overall water security and the structure of our economy than climate change impacts. The general tendency among researchers today is to attribute extreme hydrological events to climate change phenomenon without acknowledging the fact that almost all regions in India have been experiencing high variability in weather parameters such as rainfall, temperature, and humidity between years. Such variability is high in arid and semi-arid regions of this country as compared to some of the subhumid and humid regions. To illustrate the effect of climate variability on hydrology and water resources, now let us look at Looney River Basin, the hyper-arid region of western Rajasthan. The basin has a drainage area of around 69,000 square kilometers. When we looked at the 40-year records of stream flows, we found that the stream flow was almost nil in many of the years. The estimated mean virgin flow was 383 million cubic meters. The highest virgin flow was 2,144 million cubic meters, and the lowest was 26 million cubic meters. This huge variation was explained by the variation in rainfall in the basin. In the otherwise water-rich Godavari River Basin in southern India, the annual outflows dropped to 29,000 million cubic meters in a poor rainfall year from 1,83,000 million cubic meters in a wet year. The annual outflow of Krishna River was a mere 300 million cubic meters in a bad year as compared to 39,000 million cubic meters in a good year. The famous lake of Durgam Cheru of Hyderabad city is located in the Mulsi River catchment of Krishna River Basin. In some high rainfall years, the lake overflows, flooding the neighboring areas of the sprawling city of Hyderabad. And in some very low rainfall years, the lake remains almost dry. So what these scenarios suggest is that the strategies we adopt to manage water in a river basin in a dry year will have to be quite different from what we do in a wet year. Obviously, many of the popular solutions such as rainwater harvesting and artificial groundwater recharge schemes for drought proofing will not work in a bad year when there is too little rainfall and when it is mostly required. Whereas in a good year, they are not required at all. Unfortunately, impacts of climate variability on hydrology and water resources and the adaptation needs haven't received much attention in this part of the world. From a utilitarian perspective, it is important to understand what happens to a river system during years of extreme weather conditions if we want to predict the likely impact of climate change on basin hydrology and water resource availability. A related concern, therefore, is when the variation in rainfall itself can be as high as 1:5 in the stream flow variation in the order of magnitude of 1:100. What utility climate change models, which predicts a marginal change in rainfall over a 50-year period or so, serve if they cannot capture the variability dimensions? So the future challenge is in building models that can predict the magnitude of extreme events and their frequency correctly. The future challenge is also in designing adaptive systems of water management that can absorb the climate shocks in the form of extremely variable river flows, soil moisture, and evapotranspiration. Some of the strategies which would receive attention are designing of reservoirs for multi-annual storage, conjunctive management of surface water and groundwater, designing of small reservoir systems that are capable of flow regulation rather than mere water impoundment. So finally, to conclude, from the point of view of climate adaptation, what should receive attention in the coming years are as follows. Number one, building reservoirs for multi-annual storage. Number two, conjunctive management of surface and groundwater resources. And number three, building small reservoir systems for flow regulation rather than for storage enhancement. Thank you.
Hello everyone, warm wishes from Japan. My name is Megumi Muto from Japan International Cooperation Agency. My congratulations to the UK, people of Scotland, and the city of Glasgow for hosting the COP26. I particularly mention the University of Glasgow and Professor Biswas, Professor Totahada, for launching the book on the most important topic, water security and the climate change. When we look at the planet, water is at the center of the ecological dynamics. Its scarcity and abundance define how people, fauna, flora, and other elements of the whole ecosystem coexist sustainably or fail to coexist. Climate change is not only about temperature increase. It profoundly alters the pattern of scarcity and abundance of water. Unfortunately, towards the extremes. Extreme events are associated with hazards and destructions. Drought, fire, torrential rain, flood, and intensified tropical storms. I remember standing in the middle of the debris after Super Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda that hit the Philippines in 2013. It was a total destruction. People described their experiences as going through bombshells. Destruction is the opposite of sustainability. We should reduce the hazard and at the same time be prepared for the next set of extreme events. This is why JICA is working with our partner countries on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. IPCC reports have been alarming about the vulnerabilities of heavily inhabited coastal megacities in Asia. One of our current efforts, therefore, is to stop Jakarta from sinking and to protect people and businesses from flood and inundation. The two root causes are the excessive use of groundwater and sea level rise. Other causes include mass urbanization and infrastructure not being able to provide solutions. How we use water, how the water behaves, how water will change behavior with climate change are keys to the analysis. JICA is mobilizing experts who saved Tokyo from sinking by radically changing urban planning and regulations in the 60s and 70s. In the next video, we share how our efforts are reaching out not just in Asia, but also in Africa, where climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction in relation to water are increasing in need. But before that, let me close by thanking everyone, especially the students in Glasgow, for listening, and I'm delighted to join the challenging yet exciting journey together that the COP26 will show ahead of us. Thank you very much.